It's my very great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Melissa Boggs. Melissa offers a unique blend of coaching expertise and executive experience. She's a leadership, agility, and culture coach and is an active volunteer and speaker. She's here to talk to us today about exhaustion. Welcome, Melissa, and over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Also, big thanks to the sponsors and to all of you for having me. Let me share my screen real quick, and we will get going. So I want to talk today about exhaustion and how exhaustion is not a status symbol. And I want to actually get started by engaging you. So I imagine that many of you have Post-it notes and Sharpies handy. So I want you to take just 10, 15 seconds and write down a phrase or several, if you can think of them, that might be said by someone who thinks that being exhausted is something that they should be proud of. So take just a few seconds and write that down, and you're going to need that later. So hang on to it. Now you can keep writing. I'm going to tell you a little story, but if you're writing your phrase, feel free to go ahead and keep writing those down. I definitely want you to have a Post-it note or two in hand in a few minutes. So I want to tell you just very quickly why this is so important to me and why this is a message that I've been sharing for the last couple of years. So several years ago, I was working in a software company, and by all metrics and by all matters of measurement, Agile was going really, really well in this company. Predictable delivery, speed, time to market, all the things you'd expect. We're doing all the ceremonies, and management is absolutely thrilled. They are just beside themselves with happiness. And yet there was this sense in the company of just exhaustion. Like, yes, we were predictably delivering, but we were doing so because people were working nights and weekends. Yes, we had, high customer satisfaction, but it was because people weren't taking lunches or they weren't taking vacations. And so they were really essentially driving themselves into the ground in order to meet all of these metrics and in order to, meet these expectations. And so I brought this to the leadership team, the CEO and his team, and I said, I think we need to pay attention to this. I think that, we may be hitting all of these marks, but it's not sustainable. It's not going to last very long because at some point we're going to just overdo it. And the response that I got was, oh no, they love it. They love their work. That's why they work so much. And things are going well. If it's not broke, don't fix it. And I was really taken aback by this. And it wasn't too much later than that conversation, probably 2 or 3 weeks later, that I was actually on PTO myself, and I got a phone call that one of the engineering managers had literally collapsed in his office. He was taken away by ambulance. It was really traumatic for everyone in the office, and he had had a heart attack. Now, I don't claim that the overwork was the cause of the heart attack. But what I can tell you is that it was a wake-up call. He ended up being fine, but it wasn't too long after that executive team came back to me and said, you might be right. You might be right that, we're pushing too hard, we're going too fast, and we need to build in some pace. And honestly, it made me so angry. It made me angry because it took a heart attack for them to realize that people were more important than profits. And that exhaustion was not something that we should be proud of. And the fact is, there are a lot of things we lose along the way that come before a heart attack. I imagine that every single one of us can think back and think of a time where we missed a kid's soccer game, or we knew we needed to take our animal to the vet, but we couldn't take off the time to go do it. Or we have hobbies. We want to go, go for a run, but we don't make time for it. And in part, it's because of the way that we interact with one another. It's this culture that we create that says that, oh, I'm so tired. And I'm looking at you to see if you're like, oh, she's very valuable if she's so tired. And so this is what I'm trying to combat with this message. So it's especially important for our community because Agile and Scrum and Kanban, all of these things are sold to companies as a way to make delivery faster and more efficient and more effective. And those of us who are, really deep into it know there's so much more to it than that. But when it's sold that way, then what are those expectations? So I wanted to share, these are actual things that have been said to me by developers that I was working with in teams. When I turn 50, I don't want to look back and measure my life in sprints. And by the way, the guy was already 50, which I thought was really funny. It feels like we're on a hamster wheel. And when I hear these things, like, it hurts my heart, because that's not what this is all about. For me, working in sprints or whatever your cadence is, it's supposed to be a heartbeat. It's not a 2-week deadline every 2 weeks. It's not like, oh, we're going to push through until we get to this, the end of the sprint, and then we're going to push through again. It's supposed to be a heartbeat. And so we have to find a way to talk about how we approach work and the cultures that we create around that work, especially those of us who are involved in the Agile community and are teaching others things like Scrum. We have a responsibility to make sure that things like velocity are not driving us into the ground, but rather they're just a way for us to look at the shape of our work and the heartbeat of our work. So you may not know it, but you are in the presence, the virtual presence of greatness. I was the state track champion 3 years in a row in junior high in Alaska, which obviously is not super important, but I did learn a lot from that experience. So I was a track runner 6th or 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And my track coach would take me aside probably like once a year and say, I just want to remind you that you have Chihuahua legs. And it's hard for you to tell because I'm seated and this is virtual, but I'm only 5 feet tall. So I really do have very short legs. And he said, you're never going to win these races by outrunning people. You're going to win by outthinking them, outpacing them, by being smart. And so year after year, that's exactly what would happen. We'd jump out the gate. I ran the mile. We'd jump out the gate, and I just realized it's a very American way of saying the mile. I'm sorry that I don't know what it is in meters, but we jump out the gate and everyone else would start just like running really fast, sprinting out of the gate. And I would have a pace and it would look like I was going to lose. And the mile race is 4 laps around the track. And so I would just keep my pace. I wouldn't let them, kind of intimidate me or make me think that I am going too slow, because usually by the 2nd lap, I had caught up to them. By the 3rd, I was outpacing them, and then I would win. And it was all about knowing what my pace was, keeping it no matter what, and being smart about how I worked, being smart about how I placed my pace. So I see this as like a very direct parallel to the 8th Agile principle that says that sponsors, developers, users, we should all be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. Alan Holub said this on Twitter better than I ever could have said it. And so I actually asked his permission to share a couple of his tweets from a couple of years ago at this point. Sustainable pace has nothing to do with delivery or average points per sprint. It also has nothing to do with idleness or the evenness of work. In fact, queuing theory tells us that a team should have 20 to 30% slack time in order to get maximum flow. Sustainable pace means everyone must come to work every day rested, alert, and ready to do their best work. You can't do that if you're exhausted. No pushes, no overtime, no long days or working weekends. Leave work when you're tired and take time off as needed to unwind. Here's why. Exhaustion leads to mistakes, it leads to resentment, it leads to obfuscation, trying to hide things because we've made mistakes and we don't want anyone to know about it. It leads to attrition, people leaving because they can't live with this culture anymore. Impaired judgment makes me think of how, pilots and doctors, they actually have a maximum number of hours that they're legally allowed to work. And that is because our brains cannot continue to function at a high level when we're exhausted. Leads to lack of innovation and reduced professional growth. This is one of my favorites. Chris says, I've avoided thousands of bugs with this crazy coding trick that seems to work in every language. Go to bed, you're tired. No, shut up, just sleep. Because it sounds counterintuitive, but when we take ourselves out of the situation, we rest and relax, our brains actually work better. So in our top picture here, we're looking at a lane on one side that is at 100% utilization. And then the other, we've got some slack. And I don't know about you, but I would much rather be in the right-hand lane. It's hard these days. It's hard to be in that right-hand lane because we're in this open 24 hours type of world that we live in. We all have multiple emails. We have text, we have phone calls, like there's multiple ways that people can reach you at any given time. And we have to actually make a choice to turn that off. And not just individually, but we have to recognize that there are actually policies, whether they're explicit or implicit, in our organizations that are influencing us to leave all of those channels open all the time. And I would actually assert that, especially in COVID times, when the lines between home and work are blurred, that gets even worse. So recharging is a value proposition. And I'm speaking both to us as individuals, and then those of you who are leaders and people managers, I'm telling you right now that when people are in a relaxed state of mind, when there is dopamine and they're easy to distract, is when they are most creative. For me, a little TMI, but that's in the shower. I literally have my best ideas in the shower. And so creating ways and setting an example for our teams that says taking time off is important. It's not just allowed, it's required. Because when people come back, they're in an even better position to contribute and they feel better. So set that example and recognize that you're going to get more from yourself and from your people when they've had the opportunity to have hobbies and to take time off and spend with their families or take their dog to the vet. I think I have a little bit of time for this. So very quickly, your Post-it notes that you just wrote. Now it is time for a dramatic reading. I want to ask two people, two volunteers, to unmute and to read what they wrote on their Post-it note, but I really want you to do it in like high school drama club, the most dramatic that you possibly can. So can I get two volunteers that would be willing to do that for us? You don't have to be shy, it's a safe place.
Well, if no one else does, I will.
Okay, as dramatic as possible, like get your Shakespeare going.
Okay, I can do this. Oh, I worked 100 hours last week.
Oh my goodness, that was very good. Thank you very much. Give them a hand. One more.
Hey, I'll go.
All
I
right.
can't remember the last time I took a vacation.
Oh my goodness, you can't remember the last time. I know that, thank you very much, David. I know you all have heard this, and frankly, we've probably all been guilty of it. I know I have, especially since I've been giving this talk. I find myself like catching myself, like, oh, I'm doing it. I'm totally doing it. So it's just a reminder, to kind of catch yourself, because we're all creating that culture. We're creating that culture in our organizations. We're creating it with our friends. And the more that we act like it's such a good thing, that it means that you're so much more valuable just because you worked 100 hours last week, it perpetuates itself. Like we keep it going. And that's terrible, frankly. Like the only way that we push up against this is to push back. So I want to talk really quickly as I wrap up about these explicit and implicit policies that I was referring to. So I want to talk about the organization, the team, and the individual. And all I want to do right now is just share with you some questions. You can write these down, or I'm sure we're going to share these slides. You can come back to them on YouTube. But these are questions that I would challenge you to not only ask yourself, but take back to your company and start asking these questions. So for the organization, what does sustainable pace actually mean? And what are the policies? What are the implicit policies and the explicit policies that would actually encourage or discourage sustainable pace? And what if you actually addressed those? How would your org benefit from having more slack in the system? Thinking again back to what Alan said about 20 to 30% actually creating the ability to have more creativity. So we have to start thinking first at the org level, because as much as individuals may want this, if we're not thinking about these from a policy perspective, then they may feel powerless to actually do it themselves. The next would be at the team level. So similarly, what does sustainable pace mean to your team? Have you defined it? Have you had an actual conversation in your team about sustainable pace? Is there a way to measure it? And then how do you ensure that it's actually a priority, not only to the individual, but as a team? And I'll very quickly share very quick. I know of a team that actually made the decision. There was unlimited PTO at this company. So they made a decision that each one of them would take off a full week every 8 to 10 weeks. And they kind of worked together, to coordinate that. And it was clear the uptick in their productivity when they began to implement this. And this was something they were able to do just in their team. It was permitted through the unlimited PTO policy, and it made a huge difference. But they first had to have the conversation, and then they decided they were going to measure it. And it was pretty amazing to see what happened. And obviously they made it a priority. And then lastly, yourself. As an individual, what does sustainable pace mean to you? Have you defined it for yourself? Can you measure it? And when I say measure, it might just be measuring what you're feeling inside your body. I can tell when I haven't taken enough time and I'm starting to feel the stress and the anxiety build up. And then what ways do you recharge? And I think this is especially important right now, while we may still be in some lockdown situations, because maybe some of the ways that you used to recharge are no longer available to you. So you have to find other ways. So I challenge you to think about that and to really spend some time with yourself and just understand what pace means to you and what ways you might recharge. I believe I went over my time, but I got close. So lastly, just thank you for having me. These are some ways that you can connect with me if you'd like. And Jeff.
Melissa, that was
I'm
wonderful.
ready.
I love it. If you want to stop sharing your screen right now, people will be able to see you as we go through this. And there are people on this call who have obviously been to Agile QuickTalk events before, because a bunch of people have already put questions in the chat window. They've sent them directly to me, and that's fine. If you want, you can do that, folks. Put a message in the chat window. You can send it directly to me. You can post it publicly so that everybody can see it. Or if you'd like to ask Melissa a question yourself, just send me a note in the chat, and I'll make sure that we try and get to you. But I'd love to start with some of the questions in here right now, Melissa. And the first one is actually from someone who's asking about how to balance this with stakeholder expectations when everybody knows that working in an agile way means you deliver faster. I know that's very tongue in cheek, but I'm wondering, how do you combat, or what can you see that might sort of offset or change that messaging a little bit?
Sure. So, I mean, if I was having this conversation with a stakeholder, I would say what Agile values and principles mean is that we deliver value faster. It doesn't necessarily mean we deliver everything faster. We don't just throw things against the wall to get things across the finish line. But, I would actually pull out some of the things that I said in these slides. I mean, truly, it is neuroscience that says that if you are recharged and you are relaxed, then you're going to deliver faster. So there's this like payback that happens, but you actually have to like get there first. You have to examine those policies, make the decision to take the time, and then be intentional about that measurement so that you can say, like that team that I was referring to, I mean, they literally were able to show, I don't always like using this as a measurement, honestly, but just in their case, their story points like delivered went up as a result of them deciding that each one of them was going to take a week off every 8 to 10 weeks. And so less hours worked, more value delivered.
You mentioned the idea of pilots and firefighters and doctors having limits to how many, and truck drivers having limits to how many hours they can work. There's a study that someone points out in here that actually talks about handoffs even being worse for patient care with doctors. And as a result, doctors now work 24-hour shifts so that they can see the patient from start to finish, as opposed to handoffs. Is there a balance between the handoffs, or is it better for, like, I'm thinking when you're talking about a team doing that forced vacation or that regularly scheduled vacation, they weren't handing their work off to another team. That work just wasn't getting done. Is that kind of what was going on?
No, not at all. And I think that's actually one of the advantages that we have in working in an agile way is that particular team, they weren't all taking off at the same time. They were coordinating. So one person, was taking off this week and then another person the next week. And because their work was A, transparent, always available, not just for them, but everyone else. And then B, they were swarming on a lot of things. So it wasn't these single towers of knowledge that nothing got done when that first person was out. And so actually, I think that's the advantage that our types of teams have, is that there's not the handoff necessarily, because we've already sort of accounted for those kind of things. We avoid handoffs anyway. So yeah.
That's fascinating and worth remembering that these things that Agile advocates for, or they don't stand alone. They're in conjunction with other things that enable us to take time off. That's a great perspective. You talked about implicit and explicit policies at work. Can you give me some examples of those, or talk a little bit more about those?
Definitely. So, I mean, an obvious example of like an organization level explicit policy would be unlimited PTO. However, one of the things that comes up a lot is that when you have unlimited PTO, people are actually more afraid to take PTO than when they accrue it, because it feels like there's no guide, no boundaries or guidelines to it. And so what I've seen a lot of companies do, for instance, Retrium, if any of you actually use Retrium for online retrospectives, their company has a minimum PTO policy. Everyone in the organization must take 3 weeks of PTO every year. And their founder, David Horowitz, has actually written blogs about it, where he's just like, I understand that unlimited PTO is not going to be good enough, that people were not going to take it, so I make them take it.
So that's an explicit policy. What about the implicit side of things?
Yep. So implicit policy might be something like, if I am a manager and I am sending you emails after 6 p.m. unless I have explicitly told you, frankly, even if I have explicitly told you not to answer it, you're going to. So the implicit policy is if I'm working, you're working. So for me, like I just don't, right? Like my implicit policy is I'm not going to email anyone, not people that, report to me, not people who don't report to me, because the implication is if I'm working, you're working. I've heard a lot of others, like there's, implicit policies that you might have for yourself that you haven't even realized, right? Like I'm not going to take a lunch because that happens to be the time when I know my boss is really paying attention to cards moving in Jira. These types of things are like implicit. And so unless you make them and you realize that you're doing it and you make it explicit, it's going to keep happening.
There's a few questions that have come in, but before we do, Hamali had a question that I believe they wanted to ask. Do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. So, Melissa, I would like to know that if neurobiologically we think that human behaviors, what gets rewarded gets repeated. So, in all the organizations, you're working at a certain level and you really want to make it at a sustainable pace, but you see your other colleague is being rewarded just not working at a sustainable pace which you would like to have it, and so to just to make up to that, because you deserve it, you have to really cling to overtimes and all those things. So is it a personal choice, top down, bottom up approach? What is it like, if you can please
That's a great question. And actually that's a beautiful example of an implicit policy, is the implicit reward system that might be happening in the organization. I think it's a bit of everything that you said. I think it is a personal choice, but it also is often, I don't think that leadership even recognizes that they're rewarding things that way, right? They may not recognize that. I'll actually use the story that I started with. The executive team, when I approached them, even though they're like, oh, they love it, they just love to work, there was this recognition that like you're promoting people who are behaving this way. After that gentleman had his incident, there was this like recognition. And so I think sometimes it's just a matter of bringing it to their attention, because these days, honestly, it's becoming more and more evident, especially during the pandemic, to leaders that this is not sustainable. But that doesn't mean they always see it when it's happening. So if you have the opportunity to bring it to their attention. And then on the personal choice side, honestly, I can only speak to my own experience here, but I can say that there have been times where I thought that the world was going to end if I took time off. And then I did take time off and the world did not end. And so sometimes I also think it's self-imposed. I think we're afraid of what might happen or how we might look, or that someone else might get rewarded and not us. And then if we actually do it and take the time, when we come back, we're that much better. And then we still get rewarded because, we've actually come back refreshed and delivering even more value. I hope that makes sense, but sometimes it's self-imposed, I think.
Yeah, so it's more of intangible. It's more of intangible, if I may say so.
It can be, definitely.
Thank you.
Let's see if we can get through a couple of other questions that have come in quickly. We're a little bit over time, but there's two that I really would like to get to, if that's okay with folks, for sticking around for hopefully just another minute or two. If anyone does have to leave, there is a survey to provide feedback to the AgileTO folks. John Tobin has just posted that in the chat window. Please feel free to click that. But if you can stick around for two more questions, we're going to try and get there. And Melissa, the first question that's up here is the one that's come through, looking at what people can do in your experience when the organization or the system that they're working in is rewarding this sort of behavior. Are there things that people can do to make it make sort of those implicit things a little bit more explicit and visible to others in their organization? Any advice on that?
So yeah, I mean, a couple. It really is, I hate to say like that depends type of thing, but if there's any sort of opportunity for things like not just team level retrospectives, but org level retrospectives, or at least cross team, cross a couple of teams, those are the types of things that might get a little bit more attention. So I can think of an organization that I was in previously that, one team has a retro and they say that they're at a, too rapid of a pace. Okay. 3 teams get together and have a retro and that same pattern is coming up, then leadership is a little bit more likely to hear that or see that. Also just relationship building, and that doesn't mean like go in, if you can't go in and like sit down with the CEO, that's fine. But, building relationships with leaderships at all levels, especially if you're in a role of being a scrum master or an agile coach, you kind of have a position that you can do that, hopefully. And being able to just have candid conversations with them. Because I think we sometimes feel like leaders are not humans, and sometimes they might even behave in a robotic manner because they have pressures on themselves. But, being able to just have conversations with them. I know that's not always possible, but if it is, take advantage of that. Things like engagement surveys. If you can, speak up on engagement surveys. And sorry, I just saw the comment about leaders are humans. Any opportunity that you have to sort of raise that in your company, any place that you have where, things are exposed from an HR perspective or from a team health perspective, just take the opportunity to do so.
The second question that had come through, I think you've already answered actually in that one. So I'm just going to skip over that. Where can people engage with you and find out more? Is there any reading that, first, 2 questions here, any reading or resources that you would recommend? And then secondly, you're not supposed to ask 2 questions at the same time, but I'm going to anyway. What was the best way for folks to connect with you if they're interested in chatting more? Are they welcome to do that?
Of course, they're welcome to do that. I'll come back to that in a second. There is a book, I wish I actually had it right here, I don't, but there's a book called Burnout, Unlocking the Stress Cycle, that I'll admit is a little bit geared toward women. It's written by 2 women and sort of geared toward women, but frankly, there wasn't much in it that I felt like did not also apply to men. So that is a fantastic book that talks about the effect on our bodies. Like it's very rooted. One of them is a doctor, the other one's a psychologist. It's very rooted in like the physical manifestation of burnout. So I definitely recommend that book. And then actually Dare to Lead by Brene Brown. It's not directly about exhaustion, but it is about having difficult conversations and about courage and vulnerability. And so I feel like if you combine those 2 books, you learn more about burnout and then you learn how to talk about it. I think that would be an excellent start for a lot of people. In terms of connecting with me, absolutely. I am most active on Twitter. So you can find me. This one is, I'll have to spell it, but my Twitter is at Hummingbird Agility, and it's HMNGBIRD Agility. It was too long. I couldn't write out Hummingbird.
I'm sure we'll find you on there. Fernando's just mentioned in the chat window that there's a book called Slack from Tom DeMarco, which is also an excellent book. Just
Agreed.
to add to your reading list. Melissa, this was wonderful. Thank you so much, folks. I'm going to remind you that this recording, along with all of the other recordings from AgileTO meetups, are available on the AgileTO YouTube site. So please feel free to check that out. Share it with friends and family, and even people you don't like. Feel free to share it with them too. And again, if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to respond to the survey, just to give us some feedback. What are some things that we can do differently? What did you like about tonight's session? What did you not like? And hopefully you can take this with you. In the interest of trying to keep these short, because we don't want people to get burnt out, these quick talk formats are kind of nice. And this was a great talk, Melissa, even though we went a little bit over the 30 minutes. I think it was time well spent. And I really, really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us this evening. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us.